So this is Tanna, the island of Tanna. And if you were to visit there, actually, there's nothing super remarkable about it. As far as South Pacific islands go, dormant volcanoes, active volcanoes, mud-thatched villages, pretty standard stuff, except for one detail. On the southern end of the island, there lives a tribe of people called the Yahonanan. And they have an interesting spiritual practice or belief, I guess it would be, which is that they consider the Duke of Edinburgh a deity. So Prince Philip is their god. And I say is quite on purpose, not was, because he did pass away earlier this year. But it's still very much present tense. So according to some ancient tales that exist on the island for many years before Philip was even born, actually, they even had any awareness of him. They had this legend that a man with white skin would be born of one of their volcano spirits, and he would travel far overseas and marry a foreign monarch, a foreign ruler. And so then they heard about Prince Philip and realized he had married Queen Elizabeth, and they figured this must be the guy. And so they decided that he was actually born on their island and somehow spirited away to Europe. Probably Greece, that's where he was originally from anyway. And so they always assumed that he was kind of keeping the flame of their culture alive in the United Kingdom. That was, how they felt about Prince Philip. And he actually we saw Vanuatu going in there. He actually visited Vanuatu at one point, and that's kind of when he became aware of this tribe and their belief. And so it was, he did the usual celebrity thing. He signed a picture for them and said, they were quite effusive in their praise for him. And so one of their gifts in return actually was a big boar-killing club, basically, like with spikes and stuff on it. And so he actually, sounds like he kept it at the palace there. And so that was kind of a big deal. And each year, these people in Tanna would hold a huge celebration for his birthday in the belief that he was going to come back to their island at some point. Now, interestingly, I said this is present tense. They did get news that he passed away, and so you would think that would kind of, I guess, having the idea of succession in mind, it would pass on to William or Harry or I guess Charles would be the first one, but it hasn't actually, and it's not ended the movement. They still believe that he's going to return to them, just in spirit form now. And he's going to share the wealth of the British crown with them. And, of course, it all sounds a little preposterous to us. We kind of can imagine how this story is going to end. As time passes, each year it's going to fade a little bit. People will ask, is he really coming back? And really what it gets down to is, I think, an identity question. You start to question, is this person really God? And I go there because I think that's kind of where we get with the return of Christ, is we have to be firm on his identity. And if we don't think that he is God himself, then we're probably in the same boat as these folks from Tanna. And so, yeah, for me, as time passes, actually my conviction, rather than waning, just becomes more entrenched, becomes more solid. Jesus becomes near to me, or dearer to me, every day. And so that kind of, then as I think about that and my view of God and identifying Jesus as God's Son, then his return and the fact that it could come any day, it takes on new meaning. And so it's, if we're firm on the identity of Jesus, then that casts things in a different light if we're expecting his return. And all of that then, I think, informs our question regarding what does it look like to live well in sort of a post-pandemic season. A few months we're going to find, hopefully, restrictions easing, and we're going to be asking, what does it mean to be God's people at this time? Or as we started out with the question, what kind of time is it, and what ought we to do? And so how we go about answering that question, is one of the key pieces for us as Christians is anticipating that there is going to be a time in the future of the return of Christ. And how we go about that, anticipating that time, is what we're going to get into in Matthew 25 this evening. So he has 3 stories that we're going to read that Matthew records for us in Matthew 25 about the return of Christ. 3 sort of parables, I guess you could call them, though that might be stretching it a little bit for the last one. It's more just a figure, but it's 3 stories that include 3 commands for us. The commands to be prepared, the command not to put off goodness and faithfulness, and the third command, don't overlook compassion. So those are our 3 commands and our 3 stories that we'll look at this evening. So the first one, these are all should be fairly familiar to us if we've been around church circles for a while, but hopefully they've still got a bit of an edge. Hopefully we haven't worn that off entirely. So the first command, of course, is be prepared, and it's the parable of what's called the 10 virgins. And so Matthew 25, verse 1 to 13 say this: At that time, this is Jesus speaking, at that time the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. And of course, at that time refers to at the return of Christ. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom! Come out to meet him!" And then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. Now the foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they're on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly, I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." And so it's to Matthew's original hearers, this would be a very familiar setting, actually. And it maybe sounds a little strange to us because our wedding customs are much different than theirs. So there's probably a few things that are worth explaining to kind of clarify things. First, we call it the parable of the 10 virgins. That's kind of a weird term to us, but probably we would, I didn't read this in the message, but I would guess Eugene Peterson would probably call it the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. The word actually in Greek and in Hebrew as well, actually, for virgins here just basically means unmarried woman. And it could refer to a chaste state, but it's just kind of the idea of a young unmarried woman, and they're kind of in the same state as the bride. And that's more that what's trying to get at, rather than a comment on their purity necessarily. And then sort of the ceremony itself. Now, normally, what would happen is there would be sort of what we would understand as an engagement period. They call it a betrothal, and so it was a little more connective than how we think about engagement. Engagement you can kind of break off, and it's kind of like no harm, no foul. It wasn't quite that loose for them, but it kind of understood that way. So during the betrothal period, one of the important things that needs to happen is the groom, the husband-to-be, is going to go and build some kind of place for them to live. Because up to this point, both of them have likely been living with their parents. That would be sort of the normal turn of events. And so the usual thing that would actually happen is that the bride would come and essentially become a part of the groom's family. And you'll see this in a lot of actually Eastern cultures still, Middle Eastern cultures, where the wife actually becomes part of the husband's family. And if there's a social pecking order, friends in Pakistan that way, it was like... I remember it was like, yeah, you're kind of coming in here and you're above the sort of pecking order of the children, but you're among the adults, you're right at the bottom, actually. And it was brought home to me. I remember this friend and a few of his brothers were sitting around playing cards one night, and I came into their home. I said, "Oh, what are you playing?" And they tried to explain it to me a little bit. And I was like, "Yeah, but what is the game called?" And as I explained it, it was like it sounded a bit like Old Maid, except they didn't have an Old Maid card. I said, "Well, what's it called?" It's like, "Well, it's named after this card that you don't want at the end." I was like, "Well, what is it?" It's like, "Well, that's the sister-in-law." I was like, "Oh, that shines light onto family relations." But all that to say, the bride would come and join the groom's family, and as part of that, the groom would actually just build the house as sort of an extension to his parents' house. So they'd have kind of a multi-generational dwelling that way, and the house would sort of just expand. And so what's going on during the betrothal is he's building that house. And the general idea is once he's done, that kind of marks the end of the betrothal. Then he can go get the bride and bring her back to the house, and that's kind of marks when the ceremony happens. And so this trip, of course, from his house to hers isn't like, okay, last nail, go get her. It's ceremonial, and so there's great pomp and circumstance with it. And so one scholar described it well. He says, normally the bridegroom with some close friends would leave his home and go to the bride's home, where there would be various ceremonies. And then following that, there would be a procession through the streets, usually after nightfall, back to his house. So then the 10 virgins or bridesmaids maybe been assisting the bride. They're expected probably to meet the groom as he comes to the bride's house. And of course, they don't have modern clocks or wristwatches or iPhones like we do now. And so if it's after, it's coming sometime after nightfall, but especially at night, it's pretty tricky to tell time at that point. So there's not really an established hour that this is going to happen. So in some ways, it's a familiar scene, I think, to Matthew's original readers, but there's a few things that would mark it out as strange. First off, the delay of the groom. You'd kind of have an loose understanding when the person was coming. It wasn't like they would, I didn't realize the time. I got busy doing my hair. So there's like, no, you kind of knew when the person was showing up. So it's odd. It's a little strange in the story that they don't know when the bridegroom is going to be there. That should stand out to us. And then another detail, of course, that, is this idea of running out of oil. Of course, there's not going to be any shops open. They don't have 7-Eleven to go and get your necessaries at any hour of the night. And so the idea that they would run out and find some oil is really strange, actually. But somehow they managed to do it. But of course, it takes time. And then the third element that's strange is that if they did come back to the celebration, there's maybe some understanding that they would lock the door afterwards, like to keep the party crashers from coming in, because it was a great time of just lavish banqueting, right? And so if you're not well-to-do, it's a party attracts partygoers. But it would be strange that these bridesmaids would not be recognized essentially by the groom or the groom's father, whoever it was that came to the door. I'm trying to remember here. Yeah, it's the groom as far as we know. And so it just seems odd that he wouldn't let them in. And so those are sort of the salient features of the story that should stick out to us. They don't know when he's coming. They're unprepared, and then it's too late afterwards. And so that should really stick in our minds. And of course, that really then plays in, of course, to Jesus' point at the end. He says, therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour. And I was tempted there to say just, that our command ought to be stay awake rather than be prepared. But interestingly, as you look at the story, it's like, no, actually all of the bridesmaids fall asleep. None of them actually stay awake in that sense. And so he says, keep watch, in the sense of be prepared. It's like it may come on you quite suddenly, but have the tools at hand that you need to anticipate this. Thinking of weddings, I remember one memorable one Tabitha and I went to in college for some friends, and of course, weddings, you only ever remember the things that are abnormal, right? That stick out. All the things that go wrong, that's what's memorable about the wedding. So this one, I remember, it wasn't a big deal, but the flower girl was up on stage with the wedding party, and the bride had, a very nice train to her wedding dress, and the flower girl was really standing almost right in front of the train, and she was, as flower girls do, getting a little bored during the ceremony, and she had her basket, and it had flowers all interwoven around the basket, and they were just, artificial flowers. And so to entertain herself, she just started slowly picking it apart, which was probably fine. But then, rather than just, subtly putting it back in her basket, she would pick a piece off and then just fling it onto the train of the bride. So by the end of the ceremony, it wasn't super long, but it was long enough that she'd pretty much denuded the entire basket by the end. So there's just this whole thing on the bride's train of artificial flowers, and it was a bit of a sight. I hope they got a picture, because I think it was the maid of honor was pretty fast on her feet. She glanced over when the ceremony was done and they were supposed to do the recessional. She just went over, gave it a quick flick, and all was set right. But it kind of struck me as nobody would have anticipated that, that she was going to pull those flowers apart. So how could you be prepared for that? You kind of had to be just Johnny on the spot there. And I think that kind of helps me wrap my mind a little bit around, okay, the point here that Jesus is making in the first story is just that we need to be prepared. We need to be on the alert. We need to be watchful. And if we want to know how, then we need to look elsewhere. Because some things in a sense, we can't anticipate when it's going to happen, but there are maybe some things that we can do to be prepared. And so Jesus gets a little further into that in the next story. His basic point is that we shouldn't put off any act of goodness or faithfulness. We should get at that right away. And so this parable in my NIV here is called the parable of the bags of gold. If you're familiar with older translation, you might know it as the parable of the talents. So in verse 14, Jesus tells this story. He says, "Again, it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability." Now we call this, in older translations, call it the parable of talents, because each of these bags is probably called a talent of gold, which is actually a weight measurement. It's not like a weird, saying you can do something amazing with this. It's just it's how to measure the weight. And so this amount of gold is a preposterous amount. 1 talent of gold would probably be about 40 years worth of wages. No, I think it was more, but for at least 40 years worth of wages for a day laborer in that time. So it's a substantial amount. And each of these servants is trusted with this. So it says, "Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. 'Master,' he said, 'you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I've gained 5 more.' His master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness.' The man with 2 bags of gold also came. 'Master,' he said, 'you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I've gained 2 more.' His master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. "Master," he said, "I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you." And his master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant! So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned I would at least have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So what's interesting there, I think, sometimes we skip over, is just the immediacy of the action for the good servants. The master's away for a long time, the text says. He's gone for quite a while, and it's obvious that they've become accustomed to him being away, and yet the good servants don't rest on their laurels. They go out right away and get to work. And so that speaks to sort of the faithfulness aspect that they're then congratulated on by the master in the story. But I wanted to focus a bit on that other that other attribute that he congratulates them on, because he says to the two that are faithful, he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And that bit of goodness, sometimes we read over that and it's just like, oh, often we read good in Scripture, and I think what we hear is nice, polite, courteous. That's what God wants us to be, right? But it's like, no, that is not what Jesus is getting at when he speaks about goodness. And actually, this word "good," it's fairly common throughout Scripture, but it's actually one of Matthew's favorite terms. You can read, if you want to make an interesting study of Matthew, go through and just find every time that he uses the word "good," because it comes up quite frequently, actually. But there's a few different ways he uses it, and I just wanted, I'm not going to go through every use in Matthew, but a few that kind of show different aspects of this word "good" are helpful to us to wrap our minds around it, to see it's not just being nice, but it's something else. First off, it's talking about having a quality of moral excellence. And so in this story of the rich young ruler, that's in Matthew chapter 19, of course, the teacher says, the rich young ruler says to the teacher, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to get eternal life?" And Jesus replies, he says, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good." And of course, he's referring to God. But that gets us that idea that there's sort of an abstract idea of moral goodness or moral excellence that Jesus has in mind that Matthew would include in his definition. But it's more than just moral excellence. I think most of the time we understand that idea as goodness, but there's more to it than that. There's also this idea of having something that, we in English we talk about, is that thing good for anything, or don't use that, it's good for nothing. The idea that it's applicable to the task at hand. And that's the same for Matthew. And so that actually comes up in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 7 of Matthew's Gospel. I'm just going to read verse 17 there. So he's talking about true and false prophets, and he says, "Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit." So the idea, of course, there is that the fruit is, not that some fruit is inherently sinful. Don't eat papaya; it's gross and and morally wrong. You might feel that way, but it's not an ethical statement. It's just saying it's, whether the fruit of the tree is good or whether it's useful to you. But there's also a third sense that I think is helpful for us as well, and it's the idea that it's something that's good to or for others. And that comes up in chapter 12. Matthew doesn't use the word good a lot in that sense, but he does do it a little. 12:35. Actually, in 34, he's speaking again. He's got this reference to good fruit, and he's speaking to the Pharisees. Actually, he says, "Make a tree good, and its fruit will be good, or make a tree bad, and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is recognized by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in him." So there is in there, he says good a lot, I realize. There is that kind of that idea of moral excellence. There is a little bit, in the tree idea, again, of something being good for you, but there's also this idea of bringing out something good for somebody else. And when I get at that, then in this fullness, it helps me understand a little bit more of what Jesus is recommending here. That as we anticipate his return, that yes, we're faithful. We don't give up. We get right at what he's set us about, his commands, and we go about it in a way that is good. That is both morally excellent. It's helpful for what the work he's set us out, but it is also directed outward. Like, it's not just me looking busy because I think the boss is going to show up, but it's doing good for others as well. And that's part of, that faithfulness aspect is part of why we gather. We got at that at the beginning of this series in Hebrews chapter 10, where he says, "Don't give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing." And interestingly, he ends that little command, verses 24 and 25, but keep on encouraging each other, he says, as you see the day approaching. It's with this thought in mind. It's like, yeah, we want to stay sharp because we know that Jesus is coming back. And so he says, remain faithful and do good. Now, in this parable of the bags of gold or the talents, we can't escape the idea that Jesus has entrusted something to us that he expects us to make a return on. We get at this idea of sort of return on investment, that Jesus has given us his grace, his love, and even some gifts, talents that, not bags of gold necessarily, but talents and that things we're good at. And we're going to talk in the next couple of weeks about our spiritual gifts, and we're going to unpack that a little bit. But just to tease that a little bit, I want to say, what this is about actually in using our gifts is return on investment. The idea that we're doing good for somebody else. It's not about me. It's not about my self-actualization. There's nothing in this parable where it's like, the master comes back and says, how did you do? And he says, well, I got five bags of gold for you, but I really didn't enjoy it. I wish I could have had more time, or if you'd sent me to a different field to work, or trading in some other commodity. It's like, it's not about how the servant feels about it. Actually, it's about doing the work. It's about making a return and using it well for the master. But I'm not going to get into next week's sermon too much, so I'll just leave it there. There's a third command for us, and that's don't overlook compassion. Don't overlook compassion. This isn't, I think it pairs well because it's we could, in terms of gifting, we could think, okay, I have to do what I'm good at. I have to get out there and use the gifts that Jesus has uniquely given me. And then the next thing we're told is, but don't overlook the simple acts of compassion as well. And that comes to us, it's not really a parable per se, it's just a kind of what we call the story of the sheep and the goats. So verse 31 says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And that's maybe not a familiar passage to us. Most of us are not shepherds or familiar good friends with them. But of course, often, both sheep and goats are animals that can live on less grazing territory than, say, cattle. So you can be a little bit more in the scrubland with them. So often you would herd them together. And goats are a little more rangy, agile. They'll get to places that the sheep normally won't. So they pair nicely that way, because often the goats will be feeding on things other than what the sheep will. So it's a common thing that they would actually be together. But a king sitting on the throne, the privileged, and you see this a few times throughout the Gospels, and Matthew brings it up a few times actually, the privileged spot to be, if you're in the presence of any ruler, any king or queen, is to be on their right hand, because that's kind of like the position of trust and honor, and the left hand is seen as less favorable. So you want to be on a ruler's right hand. And so he says he's going to divide them and put the sheep on his right hand, the good spot, the left hand, not so good. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father." Sounds good. "Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him. There's another clue that it's good to be on the right-hand side. "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger, invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. I'd say again, it's not really a parable, which, in a way almost makes it more frightening. Sometimes with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, we kind of take solace in the fact that it is a parable. It may not be describing things precisely as it is, but Jesus doesn't really give us that clue here. It's not described as a parable. He's just saying this is what it's going to be like. And we could go into a whole discussion on, eternal destiny, what's it going to look like? But I don't think that's maybe missing the point of the story. I think we can all agree at the end of time, there's a time of judgment, and there's going to be separate destinies for the righteous and the wicked. But if we get into the point of the story, is that the king is saying, whatever you did for the least of these, it's as though you did it for me. And that term, the least of these, scholars debate a little bit. When he says, least of these brothers and sisters, is Jesus referring to his own followers only? Or is he referring to, anyone, the least of these, anyone who is poor, anyone who is in prison, in humble circumstances? And, I think probably the better scholarship, I think, points to the idea that Jesus is referring to his followers. But I'm enough of a gambler, I guess, that I want to hedge my bet a bit there too, and just say, okay, we need to be kind to everybody. And Paul kind of gets at that. He says, you want to look after everybody, but especially the household of faith. And So Jesus is saying that all these little acts of compassion are important. You know, we are anticipating a time of judgment and separate destinies, and that could lead some, I think, to become very high-minded, you know, philosophical, what's it going to be like, the end of time, and contemplating, you know, eternity. And Jesus, I think, is anticipating that even in the early church, some of that is going to happen. You get some of that even in the pastoral epistles. It comes up in Thessalonians as well, where Paul has a lot to say to people about the end times, but he's saying, you know, don't get lost in it. Don't get mired down in imagining. Don't get disconnected from real life. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, actually, he kind of, some of his parting instructions for the church in Thessalonica in verse 12, he says, "Now we ask you, brothers and sisters," this is after he's talked, you know, in the first half of the chapter 5, in a bit of depth about the return of Christ. He says, "Now we ask you to acknowledge those who work hard among you, who care for you in the Lord, and who admonish you." So this is sort of like his response. Okay, knowing that Jesus Christ is coming back, you know, favor those who are hard at work. Hold them in highest regard in love because of their work. Live in peace with each other. And we urge you, brothers and sisters, warn those who are idle and disruptive. Encourage the disheartened. Help the weak. Be patient with everyone. Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. Sounds very familiar, very similar to Jesus' words here in Matthew 25. That knowing that Jesus is returning, Paul instructs the church of Thessalonica to dig deep into good works. To acts of compassion. Don't be idle, he says. You know, honor those who are working hard among you and taking care of other people. One that strikes me actually in this description, you know, he says, you know, I was hungry, I was thirsty, and then he gets to the end, he says, I was sick and you looked after me, I was in prison and you came to visit me. And the prisons of Jesus' day were quite different than we understand them. And they weren't all, you know, stinking cesspools of dungeons, but the Roman understanding of imprisonment was different than ours today. And so one of the things was, you know, you look especially in the U.S., the cost of incarceration is incredibly high. Like I think it costs the state in America, I think over $100,000 just to keep one person in prison for a year. And so it's very expensive. And so one of the ways that Rome got around this was if they had somebody in prison, they might feed them sort of a subsistence diet. Like, you're not going to get fat eating the food in prison. But even then, it was like that was kind of a luxury. Like, they really expected more of the family and friends of the person incarcerated to take care of them, to bring them in food so they don't waste away. If they need any medicine, they could bring that in. And anything like a blanket or something like that, or even a pen and paper to write with, that was all that somebody else was going to bring in for you. Like, it was a very bare bones sort of existence in prison. And so obviously that's visiting somebody, even just going to visit somebody in that place, then is kind of a big deal for that person. And so it's, you know, maybe it's a little different for us thinking about that in terms of our penal system. But at the same time, I think, no, it's still important to go and visit them. Like, I remember watching a thing, I think it was on the Swedish penal system and how people are imprisoned there. And it was like, there's no such thing as a life sentence. And they were showing around I think it was a high security facility, but it was very, well, I don't know if lavish is quite the right word, but it was not a harsh place. And so they're showing, and it was an American film crew and reporter kind of filming around this, just kind of asking questions. And they got to the end, and they kind of asked the question that's in your mind the whole time. It's like, how is this punishment? Like, it feels kind of like almost a country club sort of thing. And the prison warden just got very serious, and it's just like, we are taking away years of this person's life. Yes, it is not terrible in here, but they can't go see their family. And life is passing them by, and we feel like that is the punishment. However nice it may be in here, you know, they can pursue higher education or or have internet access and things like that, but they're not going to be with their family in person. They're not going to be living their lives as they ought to be. And at least for Swedes, that feels like punishment enough. And whether you agree with that or not, I think even in that spot, it was like you could see sort of in the eyes of the imprisoned people, it's like, yeah, somebody coming to visit there would speak a lot. It would still be a big statement. It would be a big act of love. And so I think even in our own situation, it's like, yeah, there's probably people that, and I think that's maybe where we are challenged as Christians, is like, do I need to care for this person? Like, what if they're imprisoned rightly? And interestingly, Jesus doesn't really address that. He just says, no, just go visit them. Take care of the sick. Feed the hungry, even if they've blown their money on prodigal living. Care for them anyway. And I think what strikes me most about this is that Jesus doesn't just teach it, he embodies it. That at every chance, he's caring for the poor. He doesn't have 2 pennies to scrape together most of the time, but he's always willing to spend time with people, whether it's little kids or somebody running up to him needing a healing. And I put a reference on the sheet there. I'm not going to read the whole story, but Matthew chapter 9 is one incident that strikes me because Jesus is surrounded by the crowds. And somebody, a ruler of a local synagogue, comes up and says, "Can you heal my daughter?" And he says, "Yeah, okay," and heads with him to his house. But on the way, there's this huge crowd, the text says, pressing about him. Like it's almost like a mob. Like there's a crush of people around him. And in the middle of that, somebody sneaks up and touches his robe and is healed. And he feels the power go out of him, which I think is an interesting statement by itself. But at that point, if it were me, I don't know about you, but like as a parent, I go nuts when I have 3 people talking to me at the same time. And it happens a lot in a house with 4 small boys. We haven't quite mastered some of the, social dimensions of speaking in turn yet. And I feel like I'm expected to listen to everybody all at the same time, and I can't do it. And it sends me into overdrive pretty quickly. And so I feel like if I'm Jesus at this point, it's like, great, I healed somebody. I'm just going to keep walking. Like they got their thing, and let's go. I've already got a mission that I'm on here. But he stops. He stops because it's not just the good deed. It's not just the healing, but it's wholeness for this woman. This woman that he heals has been ceremonially unclean for a large portion of her adult life. So the thing that she's also lacking is human contact. It's not enough just that her body has been healed. She needs somebody to be near to her, to pay attention to her, and Jesus does that. And so there's this little act of compassion along the way. And it just strikes me that Jesus has time for her. Jesus has time for anybody that comes to him. And so I'm convicted there because it's not my natural inclination. But I think the good news is it's like, whether I'm unprepared, whether I'm probably one of the virgins that didn't bring extra oil. I'm not always good and faithful. I often overlook compassion, but in the midst of that, Jesus has grace for me still. That his love is at work in my life, and he's changing me into a person that is more like that. 2 examples kind of came to mind of, maybe big and small ways that Jesus changes us, and ways that we can wrap our head around this idea of, what are some of the little things that we can do in our day? What is the resource that God has gifted us with? And for me, one of the people that stands out in that way was my mother-in-law, actually, Cheryl. She was just always had a ton of energy for people, and she was never struck me as uncomfortable in her own skin. Like, she was always just glad to be the person that she was going to be. And so Tabitha tells stories of her always being a night owl, and especially during the summer when they were bringing in the garden, she would stay up late preserving stuff. And her dad was not a night owl; he was a morning person, and so they'd all go to bed, and she would be up into the wee hours, doing stuff. And famously, actually, the Bible school that she and Tabitha and I all went to. The president at the time that she was there was a man by the name of Wilf Johnson, who was also famous for being up at all nights of the hour. He would often travel around to different churches at great distances from the college so that he could drive back then Sunday through the night Sunday and be back in time for class in the morning and function on very little sleep. But anyway, they kind of happened to run across each other in this way, in that he was in the Rocky Mountain house area where my in-laws used to live. And he was just passing through their little town at about 2 a.m. And he knew Cheryl sometimes stayed up, so he said, mentally he was thinking, I won't knock at their door or ring the doorbell if, everybody's asleep. But if I see a light on, maybe I'll just go quietly rap at the door. And so he drives by, and sure enough, the light is on. Raps on the door, and Cheryl is up blanching beans from the garden. In the middle of this, and he says, I just thought I'd stop in and see how you're doing. She says, come on in, I got a pot of coffee on. Just like that. I was like, who has coffee brewing at 2 a.m? But my mother-in-law did, and it was just perfectly natural for her. And it just kind of struck me. It's like, yeah, that I think one of the gifts I overlook sometimes is just that being hospitable to people that are coming through, and it's like, yeah, she didn't lose her reward there. So maybe it's, keeping a pot of coffee on, or maybe it's, keeping a casserole in the fridge. Maybe, we're in different circumstances. Maybe it's, grabbing a bite of lunch with a coworker, downtown Edmonton. Wherever we are, I hope that we, like Jesus, have time for people, and I keep coming back to the Good Samaritan. I guess it's on my mind a lot, but the idea that, there's interruptions along the way and we're okay with that. And I hope that characterizes our post-pandemic experience as well. But I want to come back actually to Prince Philip. Not that I think we should worship him or expect his return, but something about his story kind of strikes me as well. He was a British naval officer in his own right when he began dating then Princess Elizabeth. Kind of hard to imagine the Queen as a young princess, but it did happen. And actually, Philip was actually a prince in his own right. I didn't know that until I started reading up on him this week. He was a prince in his own right before they were dating. He was actually from Greece. And so as they got more serious and were going to become engaged, actually one of the things he had to do was give up his any claim to the Greek throne, which wasn't a big deal by the late 40s. The Greek throne was even more in waning than the British one, but it was something that he had to give up. And then actually they got married, and that kind of narrowed his world a little bit more, even, because then, if you were interested in politics at any time, as soon as you're what's in the British Empire officially called the Prince Consort, you're not allowed to enter political life at all. Like it's seen as like a conflict of interest, because of course, well, it's not just seen as a conflict of interest, it is. And so that was another avenue that was closed to him. And now they were married, but they weren't king and queen yet, actually. They were still prince and princess. And so he actually carried on his naval career for a few more years, rose to the rank of commander of his own accord. And then of course, Elizabeth's father passed away quite unexpectedly in the early 50s, and so she became queen. Almost overnight, seemingly. So that was kind of the end of his military career as well as a commander. He couldn't be off. At the time, I think they were stationed in the Mediterranean Ocean at one of the British bases, naval bases there, and so he had to come back. And so it strikes me as kind of an interesting point of decision for Philip at that point, the mid-50s. What are you going to do with your life at this point? Like, a lot of avenues have really been curtailed or closed, and I think it would have been really easy to just kind of sit back like the Cheshire Cat and just have a big grin and not do much. and it probably was tempting. But what's interesting to me is that, Philip asks this question, now what? And you can tell from his life and his legacy that he is not interested in just, putting an indent on the couch. He actually, becomes quite well known for advocating, especially for youth and teenagers, especially through the 60s and 70s. He begins creates some foundations for advocating, especially for athletics for them. And despite not holding formal rank or official rank anymore, he's still very close with the military, and he realizes, even though he's in maybe a ceremonial role, he can do a lot to help military veterans and visit military units. And so he, looking back, it's like he actually did that for 60 years. He wasn't a god, certainly, despite what those folks in the South Pacific thought. And even looking back at his record, he was not a politically correct person by any stretch of the imagination. He was not perfect. He offended people over the years. But at the same time, I think there's something striking about someone who realizes, okay, what I had determined I was going to do with my life is maybe not open to me. Now I've got time in front of me, and I've got actually incredible resources to do some good. And what can I get about? And he strikes me in that way of maybe being a little closer to the good and faithful servant than many other people. And I think that's sort of what we, the legacy that we want to look back on, that whether we go to see the Lord ourselves or whether he comes back to find us, that he finds us faithful in what he's given us, whether it's in, the grand use of the unique gifts and talents that he's given us, or whether it's just in small acts of compassion all along the way, that we leave a legacy, a trail of breadcrumbs of compassion behind us. I hope that can be said of all of us, and I hope in Jesus Christ we have the power to do that. Let's take a moment and pray, and then we'll close with a song. Lord, thank you that we don't just labor on indefinitely here, Lord, that we have hope, that you are returning, and that you're going to right all the wrongs and correct all the injustices in our world, Lord. And it's exciting to anticipate that, but it's also exciting to join with you in that work now. And Lord, we thank you that you notice it all. As you said, even a cup of cold water doesn't escape your notice, Lord. And so it's whether it's encouraging fellow believers, Lord, or whether it's compassion and kindness to those outside the faith, Lord, we want to be those people. We want to leave a legacy that we can be proud of, Lord. Not in the sinful sense, Lord, but in the sense that when we meet you, either way, you can look at us and say, well done, good and faithful servant. Lord, we know that's not because we turn into perfect people or somehow pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, but it's all because of the riches that you've given us. And so we thank you for everything we have in Jesus Christ. Amen.